women-owned businesses are better investments. If this is the case, why are so few women entrepreneurs funded, even though women-led companies are better investments overall for investors? How do we make it easier for women to get access to funding? What has to happen, and what should we be having conversations about if we want women entrepreneurs in Asia to succeed? Hello and welcome to Season 6 of the Womenpreneur Asia podcast, and I'm your host, Krista Good. My mission is to uncover the stories and strategies of Asian women entrepreneurs in Asia to help you as you navigate your own business journey. Today's episode is brought to you by Redbox Studio. Today's episode is with a Singapore-based author, Winnie Wong. Winnie is an educator and researcher and has had more than 10 years of corporate experience working with startups and tech companies. In this episode, we talk about her book writing process, and her findings and key learnings from her book titled, You Don't Have to Look the Part, How East Asian Women Thrive as Entrepreneurs. In her book, she writes about Melanie Perkins of Canva, who took 3 years to fundraise and who wrote a note to keep herself going despite the initial rejections. She also recounts the story of Vicky Tsai, the founder of Tatcha, who was told she didn't look like the CEO and was asked to step down from the business she started. We spoke about the role models that we aspire to follow. We also spoke about doing something despite the fears and the humiliation of failing. Winnie took a year to write her book and even raise money through pre-orders. She has had to market the book too, leveraging LinkedIn. She said that Twitter and Instagram just weren't her thing and has found supporters for her book from people she knew and people she didn't. Here's a fun fact about Winnie. Her parents are Malaysian. And now let's get into today's conversation. Hi Winnie, welcome to Womenpreneur Asia.
Hi Krista, thank you so much for having me.
So Winnie, most of the time I have very different guests on my podcast, but today you're really different. So I would really like to get into that in a while. But before I do so, where are you today?
Today I'm based in Singapore. I'm a permanent resident of Singapore, but I do hold Canadian citizenship. So I was originally born and raised in Canada. And I'm a product of scholarships, actually. So I was very fortunate to get a lot of scholarship money to travel around the world as a student, which allowed me to study in French-speaking Canada, the United Kingdom, China, later also Singapore and France. But what I loved about being a student and, being a product of scholarships was that I learned a lot about identity while traveling around the world, and then eventually deciding that I wanted to move to Asia because I just discovered another side of my identity when I was living in China. And so that's how I moved to Singapore in late 2015.
So before we get into the reason why you're on the podcast today, you also mentioned that you grew up in Canada. And how were growing up years in Canada like?
Cold.
Unlike Singapore, which is very hot, right? Especially right now.
That's the first thing that people tell me is like, isn't it cold? So yeah, it was very cold. I think the summers, the winters can be negative 37 degrees Celsius and the summers can be positive 37 degrees Celsius. So there's quite a wide range of temperatures, which can be great for your skin, by the way, because your skin and the pores are used to contracting and expanding. So they're really great for you. But I think growing up in Canada, I felt very lucky. My parents are originally from Malaysia. So my dad's from Kuala Lumpur and then my mother's from Penang. They moved to Canada as immigrants and after going to school and working in Malaysia for a couple of years. And I grew up as kind of like that second generation immigrant in Canada as a Chinese-born Canadian. So even though my parents never told me we are poor or anything like that, they always were very careful with their money. And so I always learned, there's always a trade-off for everything. If we're going to buy this, that means that we will not buy, if we're going to buy A, we're not going to buy B, So I realized, initially I kind of thought, we might have less than others. But what I realized now was that they were just extremely frugal. And all those opportunities that I ever had that would push me and boost me in my academic career were because they decided this is important, we're going to support you in this. One example was that I was accepted into a summer STEM program, so science, technology, engineering, and management program over the summer in a university that was maybe a 5-hour plane ride away. And I saw the fees, and there was something like 2,000 Canadian dollars at the time. And I wasn't sure whether I'd be able to go. I had applied. I was hoping maybe there's going to be some kind of funding or scholarship. And then my mom just told me, don't worry, we have it covered. Don't worry. We'll make sure that you can do this, So, and I also grew up with learning piano all my, for 10 years of my life, every Sunday at my piano teacher's place. So they really invested in things that taught me discipline and taught me, about hard work. So even then, when I was 13 years old, they said, okay, it's time for you to get your first job. And so I got my first job tutoring students at Kumon tuition centers. And I was making $7 an hour, but it gave me a lot of financial freedom at the time to be able to, if I want to go out for lunch, I can go out for lunch with my friends. Or if I want to buy something for myself, I can buy a t-shirt or my own clothes. So I learned to be a lot more financially independent from a young age because of the way that my parents brought me up. And a part of that was that frugality of the immigrant lifestyle.
Are you the only child?
No, I'm very lucky to have 2 older sisters. So I think that helped with also the parenting, where I got a bit more freedom than other children might have. The reason why I'm a product of scholarships is because for my 2 sisters, parents had saved up enough for them to study in our town, which is the biggest city of Canada, Toronto. But I wanted a different experience. I wanted to be able to study in another town that was 3 hours away. And, that gets expensive. The living expenses, the travel, the transportation, the food, and then also being able to travel around the world would be expensive. So I had to figure out, how do I make that work? And, that's how I just did a lot of research about scholarships. I really worked hard for them too. But that really changed my worldview because I was able to financially get the support I needed to pursue these academic adventures.
Which also leads us to where you are right now in Singapore, right? Because I think all those dots are finally connected. So Winnie, you have something very exciting coming out. So could you let us know a little bit more about that project of yours?
Yeah. So I have a book coming out called You Don't Have to Look the Part: How East Asian Women Thrive as Entrepreneurs. And it will be coming out in June 2023. And I'm very excited about it because it's been a passion project of mine. It was just something I kind of have leaned into for a long time. And to be able to write a book that I think connects with a lot of people in the region. And it's really exciting that it's going to make an influence and an impact on other people's lives. So this book is about the hurdles that East Asian women face, first in the workforce, that often pushes them out to search for a better working condition or the ability to earn through becoming entrepreneurs. And as entrepreneurs, they face many battles or many challenges, one of which is that only 2% of venture capital funding goes towards female-led startups, although women own 1/3 of businesses worldwide. So there's a huge gap in that. And in my book, I really explore, why is there a gap, whether they're visible or invisible barriers. And then the second part of my book then goes into, some of the keys of themes of success from exploring and researching some of the successful East Asian female founders, like Vicky Tsai, the founder of Tatcha, which she sold to Unilever back in 2019, or Melanie Perkins, the founder of Canva, or Jess Lee, the co-founder of Polyvore, who eventually became the first American partner of the venture capital fund Sequoia. So I go into the different themes of success that I learned through studying these different founders, and I boil them down into 7 different themes. And then finally at the end is really the third part of the book is about the community. Like how can our communities, whether it's our governments, our educators, and investors, how can we better support female entrepreneurs? So I'm really excited to be here with you today, Krista. And I felt like, I'm so excited because Womanpreneur Asia is so aligned with this mission of supporting female entrepreneurship. So I'm really excited to also learn from you throughout this discussion about what you've learned throughout these many conversations you've had too.
Both of us work towards promoting Asian women entrepreneurs. And when you reached out to me, I felt that it was such an exciting thing because finally someone wrote a book about it. Someone wrote a book, and not just any book, but a book that really addresses some of the systemic problems in our society, well, probably globally as well. But why women aren't funded is one thing. But I love the stories in your book. And I think that really makes the book come alive for me. And I realized that the stories really do talk about the realities of being a woman in business. And of course, yours is focusing on East Asian women. So I know this is a passion project of yours, but how did that passion, come about? So where did that first spark come about?
So I guess there's like two stories. One is that, when I thought about writing the book, I thought, you know what? I teach this course in sales and channel management at this university. I might as well write a book about what I know and then scaling, So it was very like profit driven. It was about like becoming a subject matter expert in this course that I was already teaching to MBA students. So that's kind of how I started going down the book writing journey. But then as I took a writing course, and as we went through, there's different stages in this writing course, and it was a 5-month writing course. The first month is really just deciding what's the right topic for you. And, when I got on the phone call with the leader of this course, it was very clear that my book would not be about sales and channel management. And I don't think, honestly, I could talk about it for a whole year because that's how long this whole book writing and publishing process is, where your brain's thinking about it for something like 20 hours a week, and you have to be excited about a topic and the energy has to show, whenever you're talking. And even in this discussion with you, right? Yeah. You can tell if someone's interested or not in this topic that they're talking about. So the second story really is about, what inspired me to write this book in particular about East Asian women entrepreneurs. So when I moved to Singapore, I had a huge mindset shift because I had to redefine equality and equity, because coming from Canada, we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that instills early on at a young age. They tell us everyone is equal, no matter whatever your race is, whatever your gender is, whatever your age is, whatever, all these things, whether your sexual orientation, they really instill in us at a young age that everyone is equal. So I had friends who were Italian, Pakistani, Taiwanese. I had a lot of friends that were just different backgrounds when I was growing up as a child. And also, like, labor is very expensive in Canada. So this also meant that I learned to do everything myself too. So cleaning the house, washing my own toilet all the time, doing my own laundry, those types of things. So moving to Singapore, I realized that there's this whole concept of a foreign domestic helper. Singapore has a very, very high GDP per capita. It's one of the wealthier countries in the Southeast Asian region. And so a minimal wage here in Singapore would be a very high wage in a place like the Philippines or in Indonesia. So many workers are transported or imported into Singapore to become foreign domestic workers. So they live in the home and they work in the home and they're performing many domestic duties. So in Singapore, there's 250,000 foreign domestic workers who work here currently. And
that's a
surprisingly,
lot.
it's a lot. Yeah. Yeah, I think it was something like 1 in 5 households in Singapore have a foreign domestic helper. So, and people have cleaning ladies as well who come in and out, but to have 1 in 5 have someone living with them who are like, full-time help essentially. So interestingly enough, I learned that many of them will stay here for something like 40 years, and they'll go back to the Philippines or wherever they call home. And after sending money every year, and they maybe make something like 500 USD a month, or between 300 to 500 USD a month, what they find is that their family has kind of squandered the money. And they might see a nice motorcycle at the front of the home, but otherwise everything else has stayed the same with their family. And the cycle of poverty continues on for their family. So it's really saddening to hear this after, they've just worked their entire lives away from their children oftentimes. Someone else has often raised their own children. So I felt an intense sense of, honestly, guilt about my position in life. And so I learned about this organization called IDA, and they teach courses in entrepreneurship, financial literacy, and technology to these foreign domestic workers on their only day off. So every other Sunday, they'll take, 3 hours of classes in each of these different subjects so that they learn how to build business skills. They learn how to save money. They learn how to invest money. They learn how to build businesses with sustainable profits and returns. So some of these businesses could be buying land and then renting it out for farming or agriculture. That could be one example. Others have started stores. One of my mentees actually started an ice business where she would make ice because a lot of the people in her town, they don't have refrigerators. So they would use ice to preserve food. It's a very sustainable model, actually, because these families need ice every single day. So it's very cool working with them, learning from them. But I think the biggest change is that you see them go from being very timid, because they're used to being told what to do all the time and not being allowed to have an opinion many times, to becoming more confident in themselves and learning that I can do this. And it's that self-belief that really changes, that they stand up straighter. They raise their hand in class. When you start the class at the start of the term, nobody's raising their hands. By the end, everyone's raising their hands. Everyone wants to talk and share their ideas, and they're so confident. So it's really cool just seeing this transformation that these women go through. I think the toughest conversation that they have to go through is with their family, actually. So, oftentimes they're sending most of their paycheck home, like 95% of it. But there's a point where they decide, I want to save money and invest it in productive assets. So they have a difficult conversation with their families at times where they say, I'm going to start sending only 80% and then 20% I'm going to put into the savings account that will invest over time, and then we can buy X, Y, Z. So the result of these programs is that, the monthly savings of these alumni increased by 80%. They also double the number of their productive assets that they own, and their business ownership increases from 6% to 40%. So it's a big deal. And many of them are able to go home in a shorter amount of time, something like 5 to 12 years sometimes, versus spending 40 years away from their family. So this is really what inspired me to start getting involved and learning more about East Asian female entrepreneurship as a path towards financial independence for many women. So I've been involved in other aspects as well. I worked with the Cartier Women's Initiative a couple of years back to grant $1 million to social impact founders that were women. So that was a really cool experience, like evaluating their business models and understanding, where are we going to put this money towards? Yeah, and I've also volunteered in other ways with women, but I realized that it's just a common theme for me is that I really care about women in entrepreneurship and supporting, financial independence. And I think that's something that you also, like in the Womanpreneur Asia, also supports too. So I was like, yes, I want to connect with you, Krista.
Well, because the reason I see is that when you invest in a woman and invest in her business, there's so many positive changes you can see. And like you said, the transformation. And right now, you're not only transforming a woman and helping her get a productive asset, but in your own way, you're helping her help her fellow villagers or people in her town, or maybe the whole community back there probably be as equally inspired, because when they see this woman coming back in 12 years versus after 40 years, people will start thinking, wow, maybe that's possible. So you don't have to work like 40 years of your life in another country. You can make the
Yeah.
money, come back and do something positive in your own community. I think that itself is powerful. So that's when we connected, and you talked to me about that wonderful nonprofit that you were volunteering with and teaching them entrepreneurship skills. I thought that was really a wonderful way of not just talking, because there are a lot of ways we can talk about entrepreneurship, but there are many ways we can involve ourselves in entrepreneurship. So when you were choosing to write this book, among all the many books, what was that process like, and what do you learn about yourself? Besides writing about this woman, what do you learn about yourself?
The process was a 5-month journey to get to the first draft manuscript. The first month was just figuring out, what do I want to write about? So just to even start before this, I took a course with a Georgetown professor on how to write a book. So I was with a cohort of authors, or want to be authors, in a path of, we're going to write a book in the first 5 months. And then we were then transitioned over after that for the next 7 months to work with a hybrid publisher, where we would finance the publishing of the first print of the book, and also learn, the ins and outs of marketing a book ourselves, because it's, rather than going through a traditional model of shopping your book deal around, instead, I actually I crowdfunded the cost of the first print of this book through a fundraising campaign, essentially, where I had people pre-order these books. So I have like a couple hundred people who have pre-ordered the book already in advance. And that was so important towards me finishing the book as well, and revising it and getting through it. So I started to realize, why am I the person writing this book? Is because I have my own story too, of why did I move from Canada to Singapore? And a lot of it was really an identity thing for me, where when I was in China, I started to realize, I think growing up in Canada, even though it's a multicultural country, there was a majority culture that I didn't feel like I always necessarily 100% fit in. Like, going out and partying all the time, that wasn't something that I was really into. I wasn't like into beer drinking, and so, or like football and things like that. So when I went to school in China, it was the first time where I felt like, oh, this is like another part of my identity that actually fits. I can fit into the society. So that's how I felt like I wanted to write something about East Asian women, and that was kind of a bit of that calling for me. So the second and third month, I just started drawing stories about East Asian women and writing these stories out based off of what I learned. What's a key lesson of this person's, founder journey? I worked with a developmental editor once a week who would read everything that I wrote and help me structure the book and build our table of contents, where all these stories were part of the second part of that book, which is the keys to success as female entrepreneurs, East Asian ones. And then what kind of research can I use to back this up? So I had all these stories, and then I had a table of contents and that was essentially my book outline. And I started placing all these lessons that I've learned. Where do these stories fit? And where are the gaps that I need to actually dig a bit deeper and research more? As I mentioned before, the first part was really recognizing the challenges that they face as entrepreneurs. The second part was the successes and celebration of East Asian female founders. And then the third part was about solutions. How can we better support them? And then after that, I kicked off for 2 months this whole fun crowdfunding journey, which was really cool because it taught me a lot about marketing, audience building, followership. And I think this is something that you could probably relate to yourself, Krista, where I started learning, like, how do we build our own brand? How do we get people interested in this book? So I tried different platforms. I think Twitter is one where a lot of authors are on, but it just never clicked for me. Twitter and Instagram aren't really my place. LinkedIn's my place though. So I started just like, okay, every week I'll post something like, and I have all these stories from my book already. I have so much knowledge. So I'd post a bit, and like I'd use Canva to design my own visuals. So over time, you post a bit more. So I realized frequency and the content itself is very important. It needs to be very authentic, and it has to be very relatable to people. I fundraised for the first print of my book through crowdfunding, having people place pre-orders. And as part of this pre-order, they would also get a ticket to my launch event, which would be later in 2023, as well as their name printed in the acknowledgements at the back of the book. So how cool is it to have, after, pre-ordering a book, having your name printed forever and commemorated in this book that you have invested in. And also invited some of the people who had pre-ordered and were early supporters to be my beta readers. And some of these people I've never met in my life, by the way, but they were so supportive of the book. So one of them is a professor at the University of Toronto. Even though I'm from Toronto, I've never met him before, but he invested in the book. He had purchased because he really cares about diversity, equity, inclusion. So having someone who's, full tenured professor, read my book and give me his feedback before I put it out to the world was so empowering. I had venture capitalists, I had friends who used to work in magazines. So just different people giving their perspective, giving me feedback. So that's exactly what I was doing. I was sending them chapters, they'd give me their feedback. And I actually changed a lot of my book purely based off of what these beta readers were telling me. So it's very cool that I'm launching it and I'm very excited to celebrate. So I hope that shares a bit more about the book writing process.
So what were maybe 1 or 2 lessons that you learned from that 1 year?
I learned that there's so many people who actually care about about the story you want to share. It's about reaching out and finding the right people to collaborate with and support each other. And I think that's one example of what we're doing here today, Krista. I find that a lot of people just supported me because they wanted to support. So they pre-ordered the book. But there are a lot of people that I just didn't know at all. I don't even know how they found me. They found me on LinkedIn through my posts, right? And they're third degree connections. So it's not even a friend told them about me. So I have one story was about someone in the US I've never met in my life. He reached out to me. He said, "Hi, Winnie, I'd love to purchase this as a Christmas gift to my niece who's living in the Philippines. She's part of a book club. She's maybe 12 or 13 years old, so relatively young."
Oh, that's young.
Yeah. I was like, wow, yeah, I'd love to be a part of this, So it's cool to see that your message can really resonate with people. Sometimes perfect strangers, but I've really learned a lot. And I've had people on LinkedIn reach out to me and say, "I really want to support your book. Let me know when it's out." So it's really, really exciting. I think that's one part I think everyone has a short story to share. It's just finding the right medium to share it and finding what's the most relatable way and how do you connect with the people who want to hear about that story. And I think that's through marketing. I learned a lot about brand building through this process as an entrepreneur myself, basically. So like I shared with you about building a followership, just consistency. I actually purchased a program called Hootsuite, where it helped me time my posts on LinkedIn so that, every Tuesday at lunch or, Wednesday at 7 p.m., whatever time I set it at, it's going to post whatever I've already prepared. So I think it's helped me connect with a lot of people, connect me with a lot of communities. So I think, that's one learning. The second learning is also you really just have to sometimes we can be really scared. We're really, really scared about failure. And honestly, can my book be better? It can be better. If I spent more time on it, or if I had, reached out to certain people, or if I had paid for certain editors, I'm sure it could be better. But I think a quotation that I really love that I've really resonated with is if you're going to fail big. And I love that, so, and I think that's something that resonates with my book as well. What the message of it really is some of the biggest regrets we have in life are not doing something, right? Not telling the people that we love them, or not pursuing that career that we really wanted to pursue, or pursuing that relationship that we really wish that we had pursued. So it's about kind of going to bed with having no regrets. And I think that's something that I really learned about myself is you know what? It's scary putting myself out there. It's scary doing this podcast. This podcast is going to be recorded and commemorated forever, right? As well as the book, there's going to be a lot of critics around the book, so Yeah, I think that was like another big learning is if you're going to fail, fail big.
But the good thing is, but once you have your book out there, people will come along to support you. And it can be a book, it can be anything else. But, most people will be very happy to support you. Like you said, this person wanted to buy the book for his 12, 13-year-old niece. How interesting. And when you were saying that, I was thinking, okay, maybe the niece is in her 20s, about to get out into the working world, need some kind of encouragement, support, but she's young. So I guess they're starting them really young now. So that's a good thing, because you never know where you go with your book. And also I think that's where I resonate with you, because if you ask me in 2020, if I were to start a podcast, connect with different people, I would say, yeah, but it's scary, right? I mean, even whatever age you may be, you always feel that there's this fear that what if it fails? And I think that's something you address in your book also, about women and failure, right? And how women feel about putting themselves out there. And so that's also why I feel like you, I believe that if we get to hear enough stories about women who are doing things out there, then maybe we feel, well, if she's doing that, maybe I can try something like that. So we need to see that, like what you mentioned in the book, right? Female heroes, women who are able to show us they've done it, or at least carve a little path so that we can go along that path. Maybe our paths are different, but we can see that, hey, there's another woman ahead of me, and I would like to try that. And like you say, we want to fail big, right? I mean, there's no way of failing small anyway, since you already publicly told the world you're going to do this. But interestingly, I love the stories in your book. And perhaps you would like to tell a little bit about your favorite story.
One of my favorite stories is about Melanie Perkins. She's half Asian. She's the founder of Canva. And what is amazing about it is it really spoke to me about grit and perseverance. So she took 3 years to fundraise for Canva, which is and she's actually one of the wealthiest women in Australia. But it started out because when she was in university, she was teaching Adobe Photoshop, and she started to notice that a lot of the students, they just weren't picking it up easily because it wasn't the most cohesive design, right? So often at the time in the university, they were using Adobe Photoshop to build yearbooks. And so that's how she decided, they're having a lot of collaboration issues. She saw all the pain points that they were having. Collaboration was one of them. A second one was also just the interface itself wasn't easy to use. So she decided to build an online yearbook company. And it was very successful. She built it out of her mother's living room, and it was very successful among schools. But she realized that there was also a market for corporates as well. The corporates also needed something that was easy to use as well. They didn't necessarily want to hire graphic designers for everything, right? Just for small things like signage or whatever, they might want to just use it internally. So she decided, we can expand this. This can be a bigger online collaborative tool. And so she spent those 3 years fundraising. She first chased down a venture capitalist at a startup conference where she was competing. And then he said, you know what, yeah, your idea sounds cool, but if ever you're in, San Francisco, just let me know. And so she booked a flight to the Bay Area, and she just went there to meet up with him and say oh, I'm in the area. And then she presented her idea, and he said, you know what, if you can get a tech team together, I'll support you. So she ended up spending 1 year looking all over the place, trying to find a tech team to help her build this product. After getting that tech team, she thought, yes, great. Now I can get the investment I need. But then even though she had one investor in, his name is Vicky Tsai, she needed more. So she actually learned many different things. She learned, while she was knocking on doors, she learned kite surfing so that she could get in with all these venture capitalists. She would go on these retreats with the venture capitalists and pitch to them. And so that's how she ended up getting also Woody Harrelson and Owen Wilson. Owen Wilson's a very famous actor, by the way, to invest. And so together they invested $1.6 million. Plus also getting the Australian government to back her. So they had something more than $3 million altogether to start this business. And during this time, over these 3 years, of fundraising, she wrote a note to herself. She said, Mel, you're extremely tired. You're in a challenging situation, though you can pull through it. nothing bad is really happening. You just feel depressed because you're used to achieving things quickly. It's a hard environment, but there's no doubt that you'll succeed. So she wrote a note to herself, and it's so fascinating to me to hear it because, for us, we're worst critics. We always say, "Oh, I'm not smart enough. I'm not pretty enough," or all these different things. But you realize that you have to find it within yourself to also build the confidence. You can't depend on other people giving you validation. You need to validate yourself to keep going. And so after these 3 years, after building this company, over the number of years building this product, she has more than now 60 million monthly active users. She has 500,000 teams like Zoom or Intel actually paying for the product too, so that, they've got free and then they've got premium customers. And she's also the wealthiest woman in Australia, worth $6.5 billion. So that was something that I learned a lot. That was one of my favorite stories. But
I'm one of her customers. I actually subscribe to Canva.
Yeah. It's such
a product.
It's great. It's so easy to use. And I also use it too. I use it for all my LinkedIn posts. But I think also like an extension of all these stories, and this is covered in another chapter in my book, is about giving back too. I noticed a common theme across all these founders was that they give back, all of them. They all volunteer their time, or they donate quite tremendously. So she and her husband, who's also her business partner, they had decided that they wanted to start a foundation to give back and help, and they're kind of going their own experience of experimenting of what's the right way to give back. But throughout learning about all these founders and seeing this common theme of them starting foundations, or them starting, one of the founders, she started her own candle company, and it blew up. It became very successful. What she figured out was that a lot of East Asian, a lot of women don't get the platform. They don't have access to the men in senior leadership roles who are making the decisions about the products that we're buying. So she decided to create her own online platform that features female founders' products. So I was like, wow, great, really giving back. And yeah, there's so many other stories about giving back, but I realized it's so important that, success isn't just about wealth accumulation in my mind. A lot of it is about, to me, happiness. But a lot of it is about serving, servitude and legacy of what do you want to inspire in other people? How are you helping this world? And I think that's something writing this book has been a process for me to really figure that out myself, where I realized, I titled the book specifically, You Don't Have to Look the Part, because one is that we're our own worst critics, where we need to be more kind to ourselves. And that being kind really starts with self-compassion in ourselves. I think a second point is also about finding if you don't have the right role models, you need to become that role model for other people. Yeah. And that was the biggest one for me, was realizing, as an educator myself, I've always wanted to showcase half of the stories being male heroes, and then half of the stories being female heroines, just so that women also see that they can be leaders too. But it was so tough for me finding case studies where there's female heroes, even in the workplace or in other situations in our lives. We have to be that role model because others are looking to us as mentors or as leaders. So that's been a really cool journey for me too. About what I've learned from the book.
And I also find that because you have a combination of stories in the book, right, that talks about, Melanie Perkins of Canva. You also talked about, there was this lady who started the skincare company that after she traveled to Japan, and she realized that she could incorporate different ingredients in a skincare, and later that skincare company was sold. But I found it also very interesting that in that specific story itself, someone told her that she wasn't a good enough CEO. Right?
Yes.
So I was flawed. I was thinking she started a company. How could she not be a good CEO? She's the founder of the company. And to have that said to you, I think that really that really could be quite shocking. If you're that person, I mean, to hear that coming back at you, and that voice saying maybe you're not good enough to be a CEO, right? So I think women are their own toughest critics, but sometimes there are other people out there who don't believe in you. And because they don't believe in you, you start doubting yourself even more. So how can women rise? How can women grow if not only do they themselves not believe in themselves, but other people telling them that you're not good enough for what it is that you're trying to build as a business, right?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of research about this. Even prior to this, I mentioned that only 2% of venture capital funding goes to female-led startups, even though women own 1/3 of businesses worldwide. And research from the Boston Consulting Group and Mass Mutual also share that women-founded or co-founded startups generate 10% higher returns than male-led startups. So there's a lot of research that, women are really great for businesses. They're really great for investments as well. But in terms of women in leadership, what we find is that 15% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. This is based off of the World Economic Forum in 2022. But women make up 39% of the world working population. So there is a broken rung also in the workforce, where for every 109 men promoted, 87 women are promoted and 82 women of color. And this is Lean In and McKinsey 2022 research. There's also other research in the tech industry where it's even more drastic, actually, this broken rung. And a lot of it has to do with things like promotion, for example. In this whole promotion, the way that women and men are evaluated are very different. And it's inherent, and nobody realizes this is happening. But I think people are starting to realize this, but it's still not really implemented very well in a lot of organizations in their performance management programs. So men are promoted based off of potential. Like, I can see him doing this job. This is I'm saying a very big generalization, but it's based off of research. So, there's certain situations where it's not completely 100% true, but in terms of the research that I've seen, there is backed up data about this, that typically men are promoted based off the potential of their leadership skills, and women are promoted based off of their past performance. They need to already be performing in that role before they're promoted. So it's very fascinating, performing in that role without the title, but it's very fascinating to just see the difference, and also see the difference about women and men, how women, and there's studies about this that's published in the Harvard Business Review, about women who, in mentorship programs, they're over-mentored and under-sponsored versus men. So for women, their mentors typically tell them, you know what, just do more work, do more things that you get so that you get more exposure. So they're clocking in the hours and they're just pumping out a lot of more work, but they're getting exhausted too. Versus for men, a lot of their mentorship experiences are totally different. And I actually experienced this myself, by the way. I can completely relate. Where for men, if they're in a structured mentorship program, the mentors will say okay, what do you want? How can I help you? Let me connect you with A, B, C, D, E, F, G, these people, that people. You don't have to prove yourself. We already know that you're great, So it's so different, and it's so fascinating. And this is why, I used to work in, professional services in the past, and I would see the drop off of men and women. I think when we started out at the junior or post MBA levels, it would be 50% men, 50% women. They would actively try to recruit that ratio between men and women. And then as they go up in these professional services, organizations, you just see the drop off. A lot of it can be internal drop off, where the woman decides this lifestyle is not meant for me anymore, because let's say they reach a point where, and the reason why many women do end up dropping out of the workforce is because only women are capable of giving birth. It's just, there's maternity leave, there's all these things that are affecting them in the workplace. And still, men and women, if you're a woman, you get something between 3 to 12 months of leave, versus a male might only get 2 to 4 or 6 weeks of leave. It's very different, right? And this can be great for women at times, but at times it can hinder them where they're out of the workforce for so long that there's an inherent bias against hiring women in the workforce because, oh, shoot, if she's gone for like half of, for a whole year, I still have to pay for her. I have to find someone to replace her temporarily, and then she's going to come back. And this also causes hurdles in women's trajectory because they have to restart again constantly. They come back, their manager has changed, their direct reports have changed, the strategy has changed, the direction has changed. So it's very complicated because I feel like pregnancy is like a 2-year journey. It cuts women off by 2 years in their work in their career every pregnancy because 1 year you're just tired all the time. You're giving birth or whatever is going on, and then the second year you're trying to catch up again until you're back into that the cruise control mode. So there's those internal barriers that women face, like domestic duties, and this is also affects the ability for women to fundraise. Is that they can't travel sometimes because they're taking up many more domestic duties than males are versus in the externalities that they're facing also is that in the promotion cycle, like I mentioned, men versus women, how women are promoted versus men are promoted, there's also different expectations of men and women in the workforce, and these are like harvested at a very young age in us, right? So I remember Sheryl Sandberg, she said something along the lines of like, a girl will be told that she's bossy for showing assertive behavior versus a man will be considered having amazing leadership skills. So for the same kind of like behavior
attribute.
So it's very, it's very interesting. So there's this article called The 5 Societal Expectations That Are Crushing Our Daughters. And it shares the 5 of them is one, they're taught to be beautiful. So from a young age, women are taught that there's social sifting in school and in media. The beautiful girls get the attention, or like, magazines feature beautiful girls. They don't show accomplished girls, which is very different.
Smart girls.
Yeah. Versus men, male-based magazines show accomplished men, right? Versus female-based magazines, they show models that are often not eating right. They're over-exercising. It's not about, I accomplished this, So it's all these, anyway, that's just one of the like societal expectations. It's so interesting, this whole gender conversation, but it also means that it's a conversation where we need to involve both men and women. Like, it's not just about women pooling together and supporting each other. It's also about involving men in these discussions, allowing them and enabling them and creating a safe environment for them to become sponsors for women too.
I really like how you mentioned that women are over-mentored but they are under-sponsored, which I think this is the conversation that we should be having more, because we talk about programs for women and it's always about mentoring, right? But of course, women can be mentored to death, right? But there's this other part that we're not touching on, which is the sponsorship. And a lot of women work harder, they put in longer hours, they need to show up at the office, for longer hours, but they're not getting where they're supposed to be. And then they start second guessing themselves and thinking, maybe I don't put enough hours, so I need to be there earlier and earlier every single day, not knowing that there's something else that's working in the background for the men, which is being sponsored. And I think that is the secret, right? It's not really secret in a sense, but it's like we haven't unlocked that part. And we haven't had maybe senior women talk about this enough, about being sponsored, whether it's by their male bosses or their female bosses. But at least understanding that there's such a concept would allow us to rest easier, knowing that it's not really about not getting our mentoring, but maybe there's other factors at play that we should really think about. Whether we're in a career or whether we're starting a business or pitching for funding or trying to get more people to believe in our product and our business. So I really like that point that you brought up. Yeah.
So we see it also in like organizations with leadership. So for CEO level positions, so women are twice as likely to be, female leaders are twice as likely to be sourced from outside than internally versus men. So what that is saying is essentially that organizations are not grooming women and they're not looking at women to become the leaders of those organizations. Instead, they're looking and they're grooming the male. And so those women actually end up having to look outside to climb that corporate ladder to become CEOs. So, and it's interesting because networks are also very different. The way that women build communities and connect with each other is so different from the way that men do. And so a lot of it has to do with creating inclusive design around communities. Like, so for men, it could be like, oh yeah, let's go golf. Let's go have our drinks together. And a lot of the time, the woman can feel very excluded. Like, do they insert themselves in the situation? And a lot of the times, like, it's like, oh yeah, we play on the same like men's hockey team or whatever. Like, and so a lot of junior men just get exposure to senior male leaders versus, for females also, any senior female leader in all these organizations, you can ask them and they'll say, I'm exhausted. I'm always asked to mentor. I always have to show up at every single event to just represent women. So it's very exhausting for female leaders too. So they have to do like twice the amount of work and representation of male leaders because there's just not enough female leaders.
So that itself also tells us that some things need to change, which one of the things that I read in your book is also interesting. Is like, for instance, networking events for women. If you have it in the evenings, the women are too tired. They need to go home. They need to take care of family. So they wouldn't be appearing at these networking events or cocktail events. But if it's for the men, they can happily go off for a 2-hour networking event in the evening because they can do that, right? But the women have many other things, many other roles to juggle back home. So perhaps we should also look at there's a separate time or a separate kind of event where women can come out easily, where they're able to really come out freely without having this worry that, are my kids fed? Is someone feeding them dinner? Yeah. Or are they going to go to bed hungry? So those are some of the questions perhaps we could really talk about and say, okay, maybe the evening event, the 5 to 7 p.m. doesn't work for women. Maybe we need another event. Maybe it's either a Saturday morning or a Saturday afternoon where women are a little bit more relaxed. They're able to maybe even bring their kids along. I mean, who knows, right? It could be like a little activity on the side so that their kids are taken care of, but at the same time, they could network. So, I mean, these are the different things or different solutions that we could see. Perhaps women can also cultivate their own kinds of networking in the workforce or even in business.
And I really have to say thank you to all the venture capitalists that I spoke to in doing the research for this book, because people are starting to realize, like, we need to invest in female-led startups. Not only is it good for equality, but it actually makes financial sense when the returns are very high for female-led startups. So, and a lot of it, like you said, women are very cautious. So they're very, very cautious about not overstating. I'm like this to myself, where I completely understate myself all the time, or understate, or I'm very cautious about, like, okay, is this doable? What can we do about this? Here are some of the hurdles that, like, we'll be facing. I'm very risk averse. So there's an angel investor. His name is Kevin O'Leary. He's a shark on this famous...
Yes, Mr. Wonderful.
Yeah, Mr. Wonderful. He's a shark on Shark Tank, a very famous reality television series where you just get a lot of pitches from, like, small mom and pop, like, businesses. And he was mentioning, 75% of my returns are from female-led startups that I had invested in, because he realized, like, for a lot of the females that he did invest in, they are very careful about target setting. They're very cautious that saying, like, this is what's realistic. And they hit the target 95% of the time. Versus for the male-led startups, what he found was that for target setting, they're too optimistic. It's great for investors to say, great, you want to hit $12 billion of revenue, but it's just not realistic sometimes. And as a result, those men would only hit the target 60% of the time. And as an employee reporting to these leaders, would you rather hit the target 95% of the time or 60% of the time? So yeah, I've learned a lot through this book writing process. And I thank you also for reading the book, by the way, Krista. I love you sharing the stories from the book and what's resonated with you. I'm so glad that I feel like we can really talk about these topics more deeply.
Yeah, I love reading books, and I love the idea that, there's so many things we could learn from books. You want the stories in the book to be so relatable that people can see themselves like, hey, I was like that, or I'm facing the same problem, the same dilemma. And so here's how these women did it, or how they actually overcame their problems. So I love the fact that you featured real women and you featured women who not only had this fairy tale ending, some of them did not really start out very well, but eventually they ended up doing something that they really loved. And at the same time, you brought in research, which I feel is important. That's what I like about your book, is I think you've tried to be very balanced. So after you've written this book, in what ways can your book or the findings in your book enlighten or help people or community understand how we can support women better?
I think the book looks at challenges that are visible and are invisible. So the visible ones are, when you look at the venture capital space or in the investor space, the majority of them are men. Actually, an interesting finding is that 40% of them come from 3 MBA schools in the US, Harvard, Wharton, and Stanford. So there's a lot of homophily, which is essentially like lots of the same type of people. So yeah, first off, understanding the challenges and being aware of those challenges is very important. What's visible and what's invisible. The invisible part about men overstating and women understating themselves, or over mentorship versus under sponsorship. So I think that's one part. The second part is also in terms of those, once you have an understanding of those challenges, it's really getting into those solutions of how can we better support them, and also how can we better support ourselves. So I think I touched a bit about ourselves as being kind to ourselves, right? Recognizing and celebrating ourselves and helping, being our best cheerleaders, as well as being that role model that we never had before. Being that first woman. Sometimes, a lot of the times, I'm the only woman in the room for a lot of situations that I'm in. And it's not easy because the way that men communicate is just so different from how women communicate. And when I was in school, I remember I used to get interrupted a lot as a woman. And I only noticed this when one of our professors, he said, he would stop people from interrupting me, and he'd be like, Winnie, continue. And I was like, I would see how often I just get interrupted, And this is another invisible barrier that people don't know that is happening. So I think going into some of the solutions around this, a lot of it's awareness. So this book is about bringing these issues to light. And it's not just for helping only East Asian women. I really hope that this helps also men as well, or other people of color or diversity or minority backgrounds, to just understand about what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean. So I know I shared a bit previously about, when I moved to Singapore, as, with Ida, when I saw the foreign domestic helpers, I started to see a difference. And what I know and what I learned in Canada was that equality is when everyone is treated equally and fairly and nobody is treated any differently. Versus equity is righting the past wrongs to level the playing field. That's what equity is about. And so there's so many initiatives, whether it's accessibility, for example, with allowing people with disabilities or handicaps to work and enabling them, creating the right environments for them, or for women, right? A lot of the mentorship programs, honestly, they don't really work that well because they just get over-mentored and under-sponsored. So, what are the other ways that we can actually support women? And a lot of it is by tracking the funnel of female leadership in your organization. What is that drop-off of, that you start with 10 candidates at the bottom of the base, 5 men, 5 women. How many are getting promoted every year? What's going on? And when you start to realize and see these numbers of the decline, people start to do things about them. And then in terms of just some of the people who can help, like governments, with childcare or parental equalization so that, you know, women are not gone for a full year versus men are only gone for 2 weeks. Men also want to support in the home, but sometimes they don't feel like they're empowered by society. I know Singapore recently passed a legislation where they're actually increasing the amount of parental leave for men because they want men to be more present as fathers. So that's like one example. As educators, you know, like how do we reverse this trend about the expectations of women versus men in the classroom, that women are meant to be passive? And there's a lot of research out there about, you know, for math class or math exams, for example, women and men actually do equally well in math exams as children. But then when women are asked or girls are asked, like before the math test starts, please identify yourself as a female or a male. When they check the female box, their math scores decline, which is really sad because they feel like they're not supposed to be good at math. So, and then finally, like, you know, in terms of solutions also with investors, like a big one is diversity in the investor pool. There's also a lot of research about how men who are investors, and if they have daughters, they're way more woke to invest in females and diversity. So men having daughters is a great thing for just leadership overall. There's also things like ditching the pitch as well, where using more data-driven approaches to the investment process towards funding female-led startups versus just thinking, oh yeah, this guy, like his deck says that he's gonna get $12 billion in 1 year, versus the female, she sort of says maybe she'll hit 5 billion. Which one should we invest in, right? I think there's a lot of ways, and there's one venture capital fund that I've researched where they use a data-driven approach where they disperse different amounts of money over time to test and see, like, how is that startup doing? Are they getting those returns that they're promising? And that really helps filter out, you know, the people who overstate their numbers or don't know anything about what they're talking about, honestly. So yeah, I think there's so much that we can learn, so many findings from the book. I'm really excited to share it with the world. And I really hope that it makes an impact on, you know, the future of diversity, equity, inclusion.
It will, because from the way you're talking about it, I know that there's so much in there that you could talk about. I guess each segment would also qualify as a book of its own. Right? Because you have 3 different segments, and you know, each segment could stand alone as a book. If you wanted to write a trilogy, you could have written 3 different books instead of 1 book. But of course, that would have taken a longer time. But I believe that what you've brought up is actually very interesting in the sense that right now we have the ability to talk about issues like this. We don't have to shy away. And one of the things as you were talking is that I really always believe that men are our allies. We're not going to get to where we want to go without having men as allies. And I really always believe that if you can have your partner, your co-founder, whoever it is male, and able to see that there's much better results. Everything is much better if you have, you know, diversity in the mix, right? Mm-hmm. The other thing was because of the pandemic, hybrid working could possibly be also a good thing for women. Because in the past, women had to step out of the workforce and wait 2-3 years before they could come back in again. But now, because of hybrid working, perhaps women are able to do this work from home while they're still transitioning in and out of work for that period where they're taking care of their children or having family duties. Because one thing I really noticed is that when the woman is in a childbearing age, she takes care of her kids, right? But when her parents are elderly, in Asia, we do step back into the role of caregivers for our elderly parents. And that itself takes us away from whatever we want to do again. I've noticed that even among my own friends is that sometimes people mention that, oh, you've got a family, you've got to take care of the kids. But as our parents age, there's also this expectation of an Asian woman to step back into the role of being a caregiver. Whether you're a daughter-in-law or a daughter, there's some form of expectation in that area. So then you have to navigate and manage and balance everything again, probably 20 years after your kids have left home. So that's also something I wanted to put out there. So it's not just about women who have kids, but women who don't have kids, women who are single, they still have other caregiving roles and caregiving duties. Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned all what you mentioned. I think we probably will spend another 3 hours talking about, because so many good things in there that I want to talk about, like the blind auditions, which I really enjoyed. I know that personally for a fact because I know someone who is a very accomplished conductor. She got in because of the blind audition. Like blind pitching, right? I mean, blind pitching could also be a good thing, like blind auditions.
Yeah, there's so much going on with that. And I'm glad that you mentioned it, because we judge people so quickly, and I actually don't think interviewing people is the best way to make a job decision, actually, because I've interviewed for jobs before myself. I know that a lot of it's really just the storytelling. Like, how well is this person able to storytell, versus when you see them in the role, or when you give them a case study, or you give them actual work to do and you just see them try to figure it out and show results, that is totally different. But yeah, in terms of the story about blind auditions, so the New York Philharmonic back in the 1970s, they used to not have blind auditions, but because of a lawsuit that they faced, they had to implement it. And what they realized was, at the time, the entire orchestra was something like all men, but then without blind auditions. But over time, once they instituted blind auditions, half of the musicians getting through were men versus women. And what they noticed was that the women would have to take off their heels so that the people wouldn't hear the clunk, clunk, clunk as they walked to their seats, for the audition, which really changed everything, right? So yeah, that was a really cool story that I also came across. And I'm so glad that resonated with you, Krista.
I know we've had a really long conversation today, but finally, where can people find you online if they want to buy a book, connect with you, or just have a conversation with you about this?
Yeah, well, if they want to connect with me, they can find me on LinkedIn. My name is Winnie Wong, and my LinkedIn handle is Winnie Wong, and the number's 41. So you can find me there, and I'm connected to Krista. So if you're already connected to Krista, then you can find me.
And anything that you want to close off our conversation today?
Yeah, sure. Before that, just a heads up about the book as well. The ebook will be available in June 2023 on Amazon, and I'll be providing the link to you, Krista. And the paperback will be available shortly thereafter. So feel free to check it out and see whether it resonates with you. There's going to be a bit of a mini sale just for a little while because I'm looking for reviews actually for Amazon. So if you're interested in just seeing the book, you'll be able to get it on discount once it's released in June. The main piece of advice, or the main takeaway from my book, is really, you don't have to look the part. As an author myself, what they found was that majority of authors that are published through traditional publishing are Caucasian male. Majority, it was something like 90% or something really ridiculously high. And because I'm going through my own hybrid publishing model, where I've fundraised for the first print of my book, fundraised through the whole process, this has actually taught me a lot about entrepreneurship myself. And it's also helped increase the diversity of authors out there in the world, which is bringing different stories and different messages to the world as well. So in my role, I hope that I can be a role model to others. And for whatever path you want to go on, there might not be a role model there. There might not be someone who's already kind of walked that path before, but that doesn't mean that you can't walk that path. You could be that first one, and you could be the role model for others.
Thank you for saying that, Winnie, because I think a lot of people need to hear that, because a lot of times we think that we need to see someone doing it first sometimes, and not knowing that, hey, that first person could be you. The first person could be us ourselves. And we never know that. We always think that, wow, there must be someone out there, right? Someone out there, someone who has done it so we can follow their footsteps. But sometimes perhaps we need ourselves to be the pioneers. We need to do something so that other people can see it and then follow us, or at least, come alongside us. So Thank you so much, Winnie, for a very insightful conversation. I'm glad we had this conversation, and I'm glad that you raised some very pertinent issues about not just women, but also about diversity, equity, inclusion.
Hopefully, if I get invited to different parts to do book launches and speaking to more people, just because I feel like it's an important message. And I'm grateful for your message too, Krista, about the one behind Womanpreneur Asia. And I just feel like the work that you're doing in this podcast is very empowering as well. Congratulations. I think you've hit, is it your 10,000 downloads?
10,000 downloads. That was 18 months after I started the podcast. That was just a figure that I thought, well, 10,000 sounds like a nice number, right, to hit. But when I eventually hit it, I thought, wow, there are actually people who really like the stories. And I enjoy connecting with women like you. And I enjoy connecting with my listeners. So yeah, it works out really well. So I'm really enjoying my contribution to the women, just like you are doing. So thank you once more, Winnie.
Thank you so much for having me, Krista. Like, so grateful to be here. And thank you for paving the way for other women.
Thank you. Winnie and I are saying the same thing. Women entrepreneurship in Asia needs more attention, and we need to have much more of such conversations. I promote entrepreneurship through my interviews with Asian women in business, while she talks about what other ways can the government, business leaders, and all levels of society play a role in ensuring the greater good of diversity, equity, and inclusion for women entrepreneurs. This episode is also a great complement to last week's episode where I spoke to Dato' Judy Cheng Hopkins about the rarely discussed concept of sponsors versus the highly popular concept of mentors. If you have enjoyed today's conversation, subscribe to the podcast if you haven't yet done so, and share this episode with a friend. It's been a pleasure having you here with me, and I will see you next Friday for the final episode of Season 6.